Tombstone, Arizona, November 1881. Margaret Whitley was 6 months pregnant with another man's child when she picked up the axe. By dawn, her husband, 2 children, and brother-in-law lay dead in pools of blood. The woman who had been the picture of frontier respectability had become the most brutal family killer in Arizona Territory history, all for love of an outlaw who had already fled town. If you're ready for one of the American West's most shocking true crime stories, please subscribe now and stay with us through this dark chapter of frontier history. Tombstone, Arizona Territory, in November 1881 was a community struggling to maintain the illusion of civilization while silver fever and violence tore at its social fabric. The town that had boomed to over 7,000 residents was now witnessing daily gun battles between lawmen and outlaws, creating an atmosphere where respectability became both more precious and more fragile than ever before. The Whitley family represented everything that Tombstone's elite wanted to believe about their community's future. John Whitley had established the Double W Ranch in 1879 with capital brought from Kansas, building it into one of the most successful cattle operations in Cochise County. His 3,000-acre spread employed 12 men and supplied beef to the mining companies that drove the local economy. Margaret Whitley, at 31 years old, had become the unofficial leader of Tombstone's respectable women through her work organizing church socials and charitable activities. Her education at a Missouri seminary made her one of the most accomplished women in the territory, while her beauty and intelligence had made the Whitley home a center of social activity for the town's prominent families. The Whitley children were equally admired in the community. Sarah, 15, displayed remarkable musical talent and was being tutored in piano by a teacher brought from San Francisco. Thomas, 13, showed exceptional aptitude for mathematics and engineering that suggested a bright future in the mining industry. Both children were considered models of proper frontier upbringing. John's younger brother, William, had joined the family in early 1881 after losing his own ranch to Apache raids near Tucson. William served as the Double W's foreman while helping with the children's education, particularly Thomas's studies in mathematics and surveying. His presence had strengthened the family's position in the community while providing additional security for the isolated ranch. But beneath this facade of domestic success, Margaret Whitley was concealing secrets that would ultimately destroy everything her family had built in Arizona Territory. Her marriage to John, while financially secure and socially advantageous, had become emotionally barren as he focused increasingly on business expansion and territorial politics. Margaret's isolation was compounded by the demanding nature of frontier life and the constant threat of violence that characterized Tombstone in 1881. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral in October had left the town divided and dangerous, with ongoing feuds between the Earps and local ranchers creating an atmosphere of perpetual tension. Into this volatile environment had come Jesse Cassidy, a charismatic outlaw whose criminal career stretched from Kansas to California. Cassidy was 29 years old, educated, and possessed of the kind of dangerous charm that made him irresistible to women who craved excitement beyond the confines of respectable society. His specialty was identifying wealthy targets and exploiting their weaknesses for criminal gain. Cassidy had arrived in Tombstone in September 1881, ostensibly as a cattle buyer but actually to case the town's banks and wealthy families for potential robbery targets. His educated manner and apparent wealth had gained him entry to respectable society, where he had immediately identified Margaret Whitley as both an opportunity and a challenge worth pursuing. The initial attraction between Margaret and Cassidy was immediate and mutual, based on shared intellectual interests that her husband couldn't provide and romantic excitement that had been missing from her life since her marriage. Their first conversations at church socials and community gatherings revealed a connection that both recognized as dangerous but irresistible. Margaret's affair with Cassidy began in early October 1881, conducted in secret meetings at an abandoned mining cabin 5 miles from town. The relationship quickly became intensely physical and emotionally consuming, transforming a respectable rancher's wife into a woman willing to risk everything for stolen moments with a man she barely knew but desperately desired. The psychological transformation that Margaret underwent during these weeks was profound and irreversible. She began lying to her family about her whereabouts, neglecting household duties, and withdrawing from the social activities that had once defined her place in the community. Her behavior became increasingly erratic as she struggled to balance her secret passion with her public responsibilities. Cassidy's manipulation of Margaret was sophisticated and deliberate, designed to isolate her from her family while increasing her emotional dependence on him. He convinced her that their love was fated and transcendent, worth any sacrifice or risk that might be required to preserve it. His promises of a new life together in Mexico or California fed fantasies that made her current circumstances seem increasingly unbearable. The crisis that would transform Margaret's secret affair into a murderous obsession came in late October when she discovered she was pregnant with Cassidy's child. The pregnancy represented not only personal disgrace but the complete exposure of her adultery to her husband and the entire community. More importantly, it created a deadline that would force her to choose between her family and her lover. Margaret's announcement of her pregnancy to Cassidy during their November 1st meeting revealed the calculating nature of his interest in her. Rather than expressing joy or accepting responsibility, he informed her that he was leaving Tombstone within days to avoid arrest warrants that had finally caught up with him. His casual abandonment of the woman who had risked everything for him exposed the hollow nature of the romantic promises that had seduced her. The revelation that Cassidy intended to abandon her while she faced disgrace and social destruction triggered a psychological crisis in Margaret that would have devastating consequences for her entire family. Her desperation to preserve what she believed was the only genuine love she had ever experienced would drive her to commit acts of violence that shocked even a community accustomed to frontier brutality. The woman who had been the epitome of frontier respectability was about to become the perpetrator of one of the most horrific family murders in Arizona territorial history, all in service of a love that had never been real and a man who had never intended to honor any of the promises he had made to secure her cooperation in his criminal activities. Jesse Cassidy's approach to criminal seduction was as methodical as his planning for bank robberies or cattle thefts. He had perfected his technique across a dozen frontier towns, identifying wealthy women who were emotionally vulnerable and systematically exploiting their weaknesses until they became willing accomplices in their own family's destruction. Margaret Whitley represented the most ambitious target of his criminal career. Cassidy's background was that of a man who had chosen criminality as a profession rather than falling into it through desperation or circumstance. Born in Missouri to a prosperous farming family, he had received an education that included 2 years at a teacher's college before discovering that his intelligence and charm could be more profitably employed in criminal enterprises than in respectable occupations. His criminal resume included involvement in train robberies in Kansas, bank thefts in Colorado, and cattle rustling operations throughout the Southwest. But his specialty was what frontier newspapers called seduction robberies, where he would romance wealthy women into providing access to their family's assets before disappearing with whatever valuables he could carry. The technique that Cassidy employed with Margaret combined genuine intellectual connection with calculated emotional manipulation designed to make her increasingly dependent on their relationship while isolating her from sources of support and rational judgment. He understood that intelligent women required more sophisticated approaches than simple physical attraction or material inducements. Cassidy's first weeks in Tombstone were spent in careful reconnaissance, attending church services and social gatherings where he could observe potential targets while establishing his credentials as a legitimate businessman. His cover story as a cattle buyer from Colorado was plausible enough to avoid suspicion, while vague enough to discourage detailed inquiries about his background. The Double W Ranch and the Whitley family had come to his attention through conversations at the Oriental Saloon, where local businessmen discussed the most successful ranchers and their family situations. Margaret's beauty and obvious intelligence made her particularly attractive as a target, while her visible dissatisfaction with her circumstances suggested vulnerabilities that a skilled manipulator could exploit. Cassidy's courtship of Margaret was conducted with the patience and attention to detail that characterized all his criminal enterprises. He studied her interests, her daily routines, and her emotional state with the thoroughness of a detective building a case. Every encounter was carefully planned to advance his objectives while maintaining the illusion that their relationship was developing naturally through mutual attraction. The abandoned mining cabin where they conducted their affair had been prepared by Cassidy weeks before their first meeting, stocked with books, wine, and furnishings that created an atmosphere of romantic intimacy. The location was chosen for its isolation and defensibility, reflecting Cassidy's professional caution even in his most personal criminal activities. Margaret's rapid emotional surrender to Cassidy's advances revealed both his skill as a manipulator and her desperate hunger for the intellectual and romantic stimulation that her marriage had failed to provide. Within weeks of their first intimate encounter, she was completely under his control, willing to lie to her family and risk her social position for stolen moments with a man she idealized but didn't really know. Cassidy's psychological profile was that of a complete sociopath who was incapable of genuine emotional attachment but possessed remarkable skill at simulating normal human feelings when they served his criminal purposes. His declarations of love for Margaret were calculated performances designed to maintain her cooperation while he gathered intelligence about her family's assets and vulnerabilities. The information that Margaret provided during their pillow talk conversations was invaluable for Cassidy's criminal planning. She revealed details about John's business activities, the location of cash and valuables in their home, and the family's daily routines that would be essential for planning a successful robbery. Her trust in him was so complete that she never recognized the interrogative nature of his romantic questions. Cassidy's original plan had been to use Margaret's information to rob the Whitley ranch before disappearing with whatever portable wealth he could steal. But Margaret's pregnancy created complications that threatened to expose their relationship and potentially implicate him in more serious crimes than simple theft. His response revealed the cold calculation that governed all his criminal activities. The outlaw's decision to abandon Margaret when she most needed his support was characteristic of his complete lack of genuine human feeling. The woman who had sacrificed everything for what she believed was transcendent love was simply another mark to be discarded when she became inconvenient or potentially dangerous to his continued freedom. This incredible story of manipulation and murder in the Old West deserves to be shared. Please hit that like button and tell others about these forgotten chapters of American frontier history. Cassidy's plan to leave Tombstone was accelerated by his discovery that territorial authorities were closing in on his identity and previous crimes. Warrant applications had been filed in 3 territories, and bounty hunters were already asking questions about the mysterious cattle buyer who seemed to have unlimited funds but no verifiable business connections. The revelation of his impending departure to Margaret on November 15 was delivered with casual cruelty that demonstrated his complete indifference to the destruction he had caused in her life. His suggestion that she could work things out with her husband revealed both his fundamental misunderstanding of the situation he had created and his complete lack of concern for her welfare or that of her unborn child. Margaret's response to Cassidy's abandonment was immediate and devastating. The psychological framework that had supported her during their affair, the belief that their love was worth any sacrifice, collapsed entirely when faced with the reality that she had been used and discarded by a man incapable of genuine affection. Her descent into homicidal madness was as rapid as it was complete. The transformation of Margaret Whitley from abandoned lover to potential family killer was facilitated by her complete isolation from sources of emotional support and rational counsel. Cassidy's manipulation had systematically destroyed her connections to family and community, leaving her alone with her shame, her rage, and her growing obsession with preserving what she still believed had been the only genuine love of her life. Cassidy's departure from Tombstone on November 18, 1881, would trigger events that would make him posthumously famous as the catalyst for one of the most brutal family murders in frontier history. The woman he left behind, pregnant and desperate, would commit acts of violence that would shock even a community accustomed to the harsh realities of territorial life. The outlaw's final crime would be committed through a woman he had never loved, against a family he had never met, in service of preserving a relationship that had existed only in his victim's tortured imagination. Jesse Cassidy would escape justice for his own crimes, but the murders committed in his name would ensure that his legacy of violence would outlive him by decades. Margaret Whitley's transformation from respectable rancher's wife to family killer was now complete, driven by the desperate need to preserve what she still believed had been the only meaningful relationship of her life. The woman who had been methodically destroyed by a master criminal was about to become a killer herself, all in service of a love that had never existed outside her own desperate imagination. Margaret Whitley's pregnancy progressed through November 1881 under circumstances that would have challenged the sanity of any woman. But her situation was complicated by factors that made rational thought increasingly impossible. At 6 months pregnant with Jesse Cassidy's child, she faced not only the physical challenges of carrying an illegitimate baby but the psychological torment of knowing that the father had abandoned her to face disgrace and social destruction alone. The physical changes in Margaret's body made concealment of her condition increasingly difficult, while the timeline of her pregnancy would soon make it obvious to her husband and the entire community that the child could not be his. John Whitley had been away on business during the period when conception occurred, a fact that Margaret realized would make her adultery undeniable once the baby was born. Margaret's behavior during this period alternated between desperate attempts to maintain normal family routines and episodes of barely controlled hysteria that frightened her children and confused her husband. She would spend hours staring out the kitchen window toward the mountains where Cassidy had disappeared, followed by frantic periods of excessive attention to household duties that seemed designed to convince herself that normal life was still possible. The isolation of the Double W Ranch, which had once provided the Whitley family with privacy and security, now became a prison where Margaret's mental deterioration could proceed without outside intervention. Her withdrawal from community activities had eliminated the social connections that might have provided support or rational counsel during her crisis. John Whitley's response to his wife's increasingly erratic behavior was characterized by the same practical approach he applied to all problems on the ranch. He attributed her mood swings to the normal difficulties of pregnancy and increased his efforts to provide material comfort and security for his family. His complete trust in Margaret's moral character prevented him from recognizing the true nature of her distress. The children, Sarah and Thomas, were more sensitive to the changes in their mother's behavior and mental state. Both noticed her strange fixation on checking the mail for letters that never arrived, and her habit of riding alone to locations near town where she would spend hours apparently waiting for someone who never appeared. William Whitley, John's brother and the ranch foreman, was the first family member to suspect that Margaret's problems extended beyond normal pregnancy difficulties. His bachelor status and greater detachment from family dynamics allowed him to observe her behavior with more objectivity than her husband or children could manage. Margaret's obsession with Jesse Cassidy intensified rather than diminished following his departure from Tombstone. She convinced herself that his abandonment was temporary, a necessary precaution to avoid legal problems that would prevent their eventual reunion. Her delusions about the nature of their relationship became more elaborate and disconnected from reality as her pregnancy progressed. The letters that Margaret wrote to Cassidy but never sent filled a wooden box hidden in her bedroom, revealing the depth of her psychological deterioration and the intensity of her ongoing obsession. The correspondence documented her growing desperation and her willingness to contemplate increasingly extreme measures to preserve what she believed had been their love. Margaret's delusions about Cassidy were reinforced by her complete isolation from anyone who might have provided realistic perspective on their relationship. The secrecy that had concealed their affair now prevented her from seeking help or counsel from sources that might have interrupted her descent into homicidal fantasy. The physical demands of pregnancy, combined with the emotional stress of her situation, created a psychological perfect storm that was driving Margaret toward a complete break with reality. Her sleep was disturbed by nightmares about exposure and disgrace, while her waking hours were consumed by fantasies about reunion with a man who had never intended to honor any of the promises he had made. Margaret's growing paranoia focused on the belief that her family represented the primary obstacle to her eventual reunion with Cassidy. She convinced herself that their existence would prevent him from returning to claim her and their child, while their potential testimony about her adultery would make their future together impossible. The transformation of her family from beloved relatives into perceived enemies was gradual but irreversible, facilitated by her complete disconnection from normal emotional responses and moral reasoning. The woman who had once been devoted to her children's welfare now saw them as threats to her desperate hope for future happiness with their real father. Margaret's mental deterioration was accompanied by increasing interest in the tools and weapons available on the ranch, as she began to consider how various obstacles to her happiness might be eliminated. Her examination of axes, knives, and firearms was conducted with the same methodical attention to detail that had once characterized her household management. The plan that gradually formed in Margaret's disturbed mind was both simple and horrific. The elimination of her entire family would remove the witnesses to her adultery while clearing the path for Cassidy's eventual return. Her delusions had progressed to the point where she believed their love would triumph over any obstacles, including the murder of innocent family members. This disturbing story of mental breakdown and family violence shows the dark side of frontier isolation. Please share this video with others who need to understand these tragic chapters of Western history. Margaret's preparations for what she had begun to think of as her liberation were conducted with the same careful planning that had characterized her management of household affairs. She studied her family's routines, identified their vulnerabilities, and prepared the weapons she would use to eliminate them as obstacles to her imagined future happiness. The psychological framework that supported Margaret's homicidal planning was her absolute conviction that Cassidy would return once he learned that she had removed all barriers to their relationship. Her delusions about his feelings for her had become so complete that she couldn't conceive of any other explanation for his absence than temporary inconvenience. The final trigger for Margaret's decision to murder her family came on November 25th, when she received a letter from a friend in Colorado mentioning that Jesse Cassidy had been seen in Denver with another woman. The news that her abandoned lover was already involved with someone else shattered the last remnants of her connection to reality. Margaret's response to this devastating information was not to abandon her obsession with Cassidy, but to intensify her belief that dramatic action was required to win back his attention and affection. Her diseased reasoning convinced her that the murders would demonstrate the depth of her commitment to their relationship and compel his return to Arizona territory. The woman who had once been the moral center of her family was now planning their systematic extermination, all in service of preserving a relationship that had existed only in her own tortured imagination. Margaret Whitley's descent into homicidal madness was complete, and her family had less than a week to live. November 30th, 1881, began as an ordinary late autumn day on the Double W Ranch, with no indication that it would end with one of the most brutal family murders in Arizona territorial history. Margaret Whitley moved through her morning routines with a calmness that her family interpreted as improvement in her mental state, unaware that she had finally resolved to eliminate them as obstacles to her imagined reunion with Jesse Cassidy. Margaret's behavior throughout the day was characterized by an eerie normalcy that masked the homicidal planning that occupied her thoughts. She prepared meals, tended to household tasks, and interacted with her family in ways that seemed to indicate a return to her previous stability. Her husband and children were relieved by what they perceived as signs of recovery from the emotional difficulties that had plagued her for weeks. The methodical nature of Margaret's preparations revealed the calculating intelligence that made her crimes particularly horrifying. She had studied her family's evening routines, identified the weapons she would use, and planned the sequence of murders that would most efficiently eliminate potential resistance or escape attempts. John Whitley spent the evening in his study working on ranch accounts and correspondence with cattle buyers in California, unaware that his wife was making final preparations to kill him and their children. His absorption in business matters that he hoped would secure his family's future made him completely vulnerable to the woman he trusted above all others. Sarah and Thomas were in the parlor working on their studies, with 15-year-old Sarah helping her younger brother with mathematics problems that their Uncle William had assigned. Their concentration on academic work that was supposed to prepare them for bright futures made them equally unaware of the danger approaching from the woman who had once sacrificed everything for their welfare. William Whitley was in his quarters adjacent to the main house, reviewing work schedules and supply orders that would guide the ranch's operations through the coming winter. His location, separated from the main house by 50 yards, meant that he would be unaware of the murders until it was too late to intervene or escape. Margaret's choice of weapon was an axe from the woodshed, selected for its efficiency and her familiarity with its use in normal household tasks. The implement that had once been used to prepare fuel for warming her family's home would now be used to end their lives in service of her obsessive love for a man who had never cared about her welfare. The murders began at approximately 10:30 p.m. when Margaret entered John's study carrying the axe concealed beneath a shawl. Her husband's greeting and expression of concern for her welfare were the last words he would ever speak, as Margaret struck him repeatedly with a fury that suggested years of accumulated resentment and frustration. John Whitley's death was neither quick nor clean, as Margaret's emotional state led to far more violence than was necessary to kill him. The study was left covered in blood and gore that would shock even the hardened lawmen who would later investigate the scene. Her husband's body showed evidence of over 20 axe blows, many delivered after death had already occurred. Margaret's attack on her children was even more horrifying because it required her to overcome maternal instincts that should have made such violence impossible. She found Sarah and Thomas still working at the parlor table, where their trust in their mother's love made them completely defenseless against her homicidal rage. Sarah's murder was particularly brutal because her age and size allowed her to understand what was happening and attempt to defend herself and her brother. Her screams and pleas for mercy fell on ears that were deafened by obsessive love and homicidal delusion, while her attempts to shield Thomas demonstrated courage that made her death even more tragic. Thomas Whitley died trying to run toward his father's study for help that would never come, struck down by the woman who had once sung lullabies to ease his childhood fears. His small body was found the next morning in the hallway between the parlor and study, providing mute testimony to his desperate attempt to escape the mother who had become his killer. The sounds of violence from the main house finally alerted William Whitley to the crisis, but his response came too late to save his family or himself. His investigation of the screaming and crashing sounds led him directly into Margaret's homicidal frenzy, where he became the fourth victim of her obsessive love for Jesse Cassidy. William's death was the most calculated of the murders, as Margaret recognized him as the family member most likely to survive an attack and testify about her crimes. Her systematic destruction of his face and skull was designed to prevent identification, while demonstrating the complete absence of human feeling that had replaced her normal emotional responses. Margaret's behavior immediately following the murders revealed the complete break with reality that had driven her to commit such horrific acts. She spent hours arranging the bodies and cleaning herself, apparently believing that the elimination of her family had cleared the path for Cassidy's return and their reunion. The scene that greeted investigating lawmen the following morning was described in territorial newspapers as the most horrifying crime scene in Arizona history. Four family members had been systematically murdered with an axe, their bodies mutilated with a savagery that suggested either insanity or a level of hatred that was difficult to comprehend. Margaret was found sitting in her rocking chair on the front porch, still wearing the blood-stained dress she had worn during the murders, apparently waiting for Jesse Cassidy to return and claim her as his bride. Her complete disconnection from the reality of what she had done was evident in her surprise and indignation when Sheriff Bean placed her under arrest. The physical evidence of the murders was overwhelming and undeniable, while Margaret's mental state made any defense based on temporary insanity seem almost inevitable. But the brutality of her crimes and the innocent nature of her victims would ensure that territorial justice would be neither quick nor merciful. This horrific true story of family murder in the Old West shows the dark extremes of human obsession. Please subscribe and share this video with others who need to understand these tragic chapters of frontier justice. Margaret Whitley's transformation from respectable rancher's wife to family killer was complete, but her story was far from over. The pregnant woman who had murdered her entire family for love of a man who had abandoned her would now face the full weight of territorial justice, while the community of Tombstone struggled to understand how one of their most respected citizens had become their most notorious criminal. The murders of the Whitley family would become part of frontier folklore, remembered as an example of how isolation, obsession, and mental illness could combine to produce violence that shocked even a community accustomed to the harsh realities of territorial life. Margaret's story would serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of uncontrolled passion and the importance of maintaining social connections that might prevent such tragedies. The discovery of the Whitley family massacre came at dawn on December 1, 1881, when ranch hand Miguel Santos arrived for his morning duties and found Margaret sitting on the front porch of a house that reeked of death and violence. Santos had worked for the family for 2 years and immediately recognized that something catastrophic had occurred, though the full horror of the situation wouldn't become apparent until Sheriff Johnny Bean arrived to investigate. Margaret's appearance when Santos found her was that of a woman completely disconnected from reality. She was still wearing the blood-soaked dress from the previous night's murders, but her demeanor was calm and expectant, as if she were waiting for an important visitor rather than sitting amid the aftermath of quadruple murder. Her pregnant condition was clearly visible and would complicate every aspect of the investigation and prosecution. Santos's immediate response was to ride hard for Tombstone to alert authorities, though his broken English and obvious terror made his initial report difficult for Sheriff Bean to understand completely. The Mexican ranch hand's description of blood and death at the Double W Ranch was clear enough to trigger an immediate law enforcement response, even if the full scope of the tragedy remained unclear. Sheriff Bien arrived at the ranch with 3 deputies within 2 hours of Santos's report, prepared for a robbery or Indian raid but utterly unprepared for the scene of domestic carnage that awaited them. The discovery that Margaret Whitley had systematically murdered her entire family challenged every assumption about feminine nature and maternal instinct that governed frontier society's understanding of women's roles. The crime scene investigation that followed was primitive by modern standards but thorough by frontier measures. Each body was examined and photographed, while the patterns of blood and violence were documented to establish the sequence of events and eliminate any possibility that the murders had been committed by outside attackers. John Whitley's body in the study showed evidence of massive trauma from repeated axe blows, with defensive wounds indicating that he had attempted to fight back before being overwhelmed by his wife's fury. The scattered papers and overturned furniture suggested a struggle, while the amount of blood indicated that the attack had continued long after death had occurred. The children's bodies in the parlor and hallway were even more disturbing to the investigating officers, as the evidence suggested that they had been killed while attempting to flee or seek help. Sarah's defensive wounds showed that she had tried to protect herself and her brother, while Thomas's location indicated that he had been running toward his father when he was struck down. William Whitley's body was found in the doorway between his quarters and the main house, suggesting that he had been investigating the sounds of violence when he encountered Margaret and became her final victim. His injuries were the most severe of all the victims, indicating that Margaret had recognized him as the greatest potential threat to her escape. The murder weapon, a blood-stained axe from the woodshed, was found abandoned in the parlor where Margaret had apparently dropped it after completing her killing spree. The implement showed evidence of extensive use and would provide crucial physical evidence linking her to all 4 murders when the case came to trial. Margaret's arrest was complicated by her advanced pregnancy and obvious mental deterioration, creating legal and ethical challenges that the territorial justice system was not equipped to handle effectively. Her complete disconnection from reality made it unclear whether she understood the charges against her or was competent to participate in her own defense. The interrogation of Margaret by Sheriff Bien and Territorial Marshal Dave Neagle was frustrated by her persistent delusions about Jesse Cassidy's imminent return and their future together. She seemed genuinely surprised that her family's elimination had not resulted in his immediate appearance to claim her and their unborn child. Margaret's statements during questioning revealed the extent of her mental deterioration and the obsessive love that had driven her to commit such horrific crimes. She spoke of Cassidy as if he were her husband and described the murders as necessary steps to clear the path for their reunion, apparently believing that he would approve of her actions. The physical evidence collected at the crime scene was overwhelming and left no doubt about Margaret's guilt, while witness testimony from ranch hands and townspeople documented her increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to the murders. The case against her was so strong that legal experts predicted a quick trial and inevitable execution. News of the Whitley family massacre spread rapidly throughout Arizona Territory and beyond, carried by telegraph operators and newspaper correspondents who recognized the story's sensational appeal. The combination of family murder, adultery, and pregnant defendant created a narrative that captured public attention across the American West. The Tombstone epitaph published detailed coverage of the crime scene and investigation, while newspapers in San Francisco, Denver, and Kansas City carried lurid accounts of the Arizona lady killer, who had butchered her family for love of an outlaw. The coverage emphasized the shocking nature of Margaret's fall from respectability and the unprecedented brutality of her crimes. This shocking investigation into frontier justice deserves to be remembered. Please like this video and share it with others who need to understand these dark chapters of Western history. Public reaction to the murders was immediate and overwhelmingly hostile, with many calling for Margaret's immediate lynching rather than formal legal proceedings. The brutality of her crimes and the innocent nature of her victims had created a level of community outrage that challenged the territorial justice system's ability to provide fair legal proceedings. The legal challenges presented by Margaret's case were unprecedented in Arizona territorial history. Her pregnancy made immediate execution impossible, while her obvious mental illness raised questions about her competency to stand trial. The combination of factors created a complex legal situation that would test the territorial court system's capabilities. Margaret's incarceration in the Cochise County Jail required special arrangements for her pregnancy and mental condition, straining resources that were already inadequate for handling normal criminal cases. Her detention became a source of ongoing controversy as the community debated whether she deserved medical care or should be left to suffer the consequences of her actions. The search for Jesse Cassidy intensified following the discovery of his role in triggering Margaret's homicidal breakdown, though his exact whereabouts remained unknown. Territorial authorities issued warrants for his arrest as an accessory to murder, while bounty hunters began tracking him across the Southwest in hopes of claiming the substantial reward that was posted for his capture. The investigation into Margaret's background and the development of her relationship with Cassidy revealed the systematic nature of his manipulation and her gradual descent into obsessive love. The evidence painted a picture of an intelligent woman who had been deliberately destroyed by a professional criminal who specialized in exploiting female vulnerabilities. Margaret Whitley's story had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of uncontrolled passion and the importance of maintaining social connections that might prevent such tragedies. Her case would influence discussions about women's mental health and legal responsibility throughout the territory, while her crimes would be remembered as among the most shocking in frontier history. Margaret Whitley's trial began on March 15, 1882, in the Cochise County Courthouse in Tombstone, drawing spectators from across Arizona Territory and beyond who came to witness what newspapers had dubbed the most sensational murder trial in Western history. Judge William Stilwell presided over proceedings that would determine whether territorial justice could accommodate a pregnant woman who had committed the most brutal family murder in the region's recorded history. The defendant's appearance in court shocked observers who remembered her as the epitome of frontier respectability just months earlier. Margaret was now 8 months pregnant, confined to a wheelchair due to complications from her pregnancy and months of poor nutrition in the county jail. Her mental state remained fragile, with periods of lucidity interrupted by episodes where she spoke to Jesse Cassidy as if he were present in the courtroom. The prosecution team, led by District Attorney Littleton Price, faced the challenging task of securing a conviction against a defendant whose obvious mental illness might generate sympathy among jurors despite the horrific nature of her crimes. Their strategy focused on the premeditated nature of the murders and the cold calculation that Margaret had displayed in planning and executing the deaths of her entire family. Defense attorney Thomas Fitch had accepted the case despite its apparent hopelessness, believing that Margaret's pregnancy and mental condition entitled her to the best legal representation available. His strategy would focus on establishing her insanity at the time of the murders while arguing that her obsessive love for Cassidy had been systematically cultivated by a master criminal who specialized in exploiting vulnerable women. The jury selection process took 3 days and required questioning over 200 potential jurors before finding 12 men who could promise to render a fair verdict despite the enormous publicity surrounding the case. The final jury consisted entirely of frontier businessmen and ranchers who understood the importance of family stability in territorial communities. The opening statements revealed the fundamental disagreement between prosecution and defense about Margaret's mental state and legal responsibility. District Attorney Price portrayed her as a calculating killer who had murdered her family to eliminate witnesses to her adultery, while Fitch argued that she was the victim of criminal manipulation that had destroyed her capacity for rational thought. The prosecution's case was built on overwhelming physical evidence that left no doubt about Margaret's role in the murders. Coroner testimony described the brutal nature of the killings, while photographs of the crime scene provided visual evidence of the violence that Margaret had inflicted on her own family members. The testimony of ranch hand Miguel Santos, who had discovered the murders, provided crucial eyewitness evidence about Margaret's behavior immediately following the killings. His description of finding her sitting calmly on the porch while covered in blood demonstrated the complete disconnect from reality that had characterized her mental state. Sheriff Johnny Behan's testimony about Margaret's arrest and interrogation revealed her persistent delusions about Jesse Cassidy's return and their future together. His detailed account of her statements during questioning provided evidence of the obsessive love that had motivated her crimes while demonstrating her complete inability to comprehend the reality of what she had done. The prosecution's presentation of Margaret's love letters to Cassidy, found hidden in her bedroom, provided intimate evidence of her psychological deterioration and growing willingness to contemplate violence against her family. The correspondence documented her transformation from devoted mother to potential killer, revealing the gradual erosion of moral restraints that had culminated in murder. Testimony from Tombstone residents who had observed Margaret's relationship with Cassidy established the timeline of their affair and her increasingly erratic behavior as the relationship progressed. Multiple witnesses described her withdrawal from community activities and her obvious mental deterioration during the weeks preceding the murders. The defense strategy focused on establishing Margaret's insanity through expert testimony about the effects of abandonment and obsessive love on maternal behavior. Dr. Henry Morrison, the territory's leading authority on mental illness, testified that Margaret's actions were consistent with a complete psychological break caused by traumatic abandonment by the father of her unborn child. Fitch's presentation of evidence about Jesse Cassidy's criminal background and his pattern of manipulating women provided context for understanding how Margaret had been systematically destroyed by a professional predator. The defense argued that her crimes were the inevitable result of calculated psychological abuse designed to isolate her from sources of support and rational counsel. This extraordinary trial that changed frontier justice deserves to be shared. Please subscribe and tell others about these crucial chapters in American legal history. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Margaret herself was called to testify, despite her obviously fragile mental condition. Her testimony was frequently interrupted by episodes where she addressed remarks to the absent Cassidy, asking when he would return to take her and their child to the new life he had promised. Margaret's account of her relationship with Cassidy revealed the depth of her delusions and her continued belief that their love had justified any sacrifice, including the murder of her innocent family members. Her inability to express remorse or acknowledge the wrongfulness of her actions demonstrated the complete moral collapse that had preceded her crimes. The prosecution's cross-examination of Margaret was brief and focused on establishing her awareness of right and wrong at the time of the murders. District Attorney Price's questions about her methodical planning and careful selection of weapons were answered with chilling matter-of-factness that undermined defense claims of complete insanity. Expert testimony about Margaret's mental condition was complicated by the primitive understanding of psychological disorders in 1882, when concepts like criminal manipulation and psychological abuse were not well understood by medical professionals or legal experts. The territorial justice system lacked the sophisticated tools necessary to evaluate her complex mental state accurately. The prosecution's closing argument emphasized the premeditated nature of Margaret's crimes and the need for territorial justice to respond decisively to such unprecedented brutality. District Attorney Price argued that allowing Margaret to escape full legal consequences would set a dangerous precedent that might encourage other women to use claims of lovesickness as justification for criminal behavior. Defense Attorney Fitch's closing statement focused on Margaret's victimization by Jesse Cassidy and her complete psychological destruction at his hands. He argued that executing a mentally ill pregnant woman would violate both legal precedent and moral principle, while failing to address the real causes of the tragedy that had destroyed the Whitley family. The jury deliberated for 4 days before returning a verdict that would establish important precedents for territorial justice and women's legal rights. Their decision would determine not only Margaret's fate but also how future cases involving mentally ill defendants would be handled by frontier courts. Margaret Whitley's trial had become a test case for the territorial justice system's ability to balance legal precedent with recognition of complex psychological and social factors that contributed to criminal behavior. The verdict would influence legal discussions about women's mental health and criminal responsibility throughout the American West. The jury's verdict in the case of Territory of Arizona versus Margaret Whitley was announced on March 23, 1882, after 4 days of deliberation that had tested the limits of frontier justice and established important precedents for handling mentally ill defendants. The packed courtroom fell silent as jury foreman Samuel Patterson stood to deliver a decision that would determine the fate of the most notorious woman in territorial history. We, the jury, find the defendant Margaret Whitley guilty of murder in the first degree in the deaths of John Whitley, Sarah Whitley, Thomas Whitley, and William Whitley, Patterson announced, his voice carrying across a courtroom where spectators had barely breathed during the reading. The verdict was accompanied by a recommendation for mercy due to Margaret's mental condition and pregnancy, though such recommendations were not legally binding on territorial judges. Margaret's reaction to the guilty verdict was characteristic of her continued disconnection from reality. She smiled and nodded as if the announcement confirmed her expectations, then asked her attorney when Jesse Cassidy would be arriving to take her home. Her inability to comprehend the gravity of her situation was evident to everyone present and reinforced questions about her mental competency. Judge William Stilwell's sentencing decision was complicated by unprecedented legal and moral questions about executing a pregnant, mentally ill woman. Territorial law required the death penalty for first-degree murder, but Margaret's condition created circumstances that had never been addressed by previous legal precedents in Arizona territory. The judge's announcement of Margaret's sentence on March 30th drew crowds that overflowed the courthouse and spilled into the streets of Tombstone, where citizens gathered to learn the fate of the woman whose crimes had shocked the entire Southwest. Stilwell sentenced Margaret to death by hanging, but stayed the execution until after the birth of her child and a determination of her mental competency. Margaret's pregnancy had progressed normally despite the trauma of arrest, imprisonment, and trial, though her mental condition remained unchanged throughout the legal proceedings. Territorial medical authorities estimated that her child would be born in late April or early May, creating a timeline that would determine when her execution might proceed. The legal precedent established by Margaret's case would influence territorial law for decades, as courts struggled to balance justice for victims with recognition of complex psychological factors that contributed to criminal behavior. Her case became a landmark in discussions about women's legal rights and mental health considerations in criminal proceedings. Public reaction to the verdict and sentence was overwhelmingly supportive, with most territorial newspapers and civic leaders praising the jury's decision to hold Margaret accountable for her crimes despite her mental illness. The brutality of the murders and the innocent nature of the victims had created community outrage that demanded full legal consequences regardless of mitigating circumstances. However, some medical and legal experts questioned whether executing a mentally ill woman served the interests of justice or simply satisfied public demands for vengeance. The debate over Margaret's sentence reflected broader national discussions about criminal responsibility and the treatment of mentally ill defendants in American legal systems. Margaret's incarceration in the territorial prison at Yuma presented unique challenges for corrections officials who had never housed a pregnant female defendant awaiting execution. Special arrangements were required for her medical care and security, while her persistent delusions about Jesse Cassidy's return created ongoing management difficulties. The search for Jesse Cassidy intensified following the trial, as territorial authorities sought to bring him to justice as an accessory to the Whitley family murders. Bounty hunters and law enforcement officers tracked him across the Southwest, though his exact whereabouts remained unknown. Reports placed him in various locations from California to Texas, but none were confirmed by reliable sources. Margaret gave birth to a daughter on May 12, 1882, under circumstances that provided minimal medical care and no privacy. The child was immediately placed with a Catholic orphanage in Phoenix, where she would be raised without knowledge of her parents' identities or the circumstances of her birth. Margaret never saw her daughter after the delivery, which marked the final separation from family relationships. The birth of Margaret's child created new legal questions about the timing of her execution and the custody arrangements for the infant. Territorial law provided no clear guidance about how long execution should be delayed following childbirth, while the child's parentage created complex legal issues about inheritance and guardianship. This groundbreaking case that changed territorial law deserves to be remembered. Please share this video with others who need to understand these crucial developments in frontier justice. Margaret's mental condition showed no improvement following the birth of her child, as she continued to express belief that Jesse Cassidy would return to claim both her and their daughter. Her inability to acknowledge the reality of her situation or express remorse for her crimes made arguments for commuting her sentence increasingly difficult to sustain. The final legal review of Margaret's case was conducted by Territorial Governor John Fremont, who had the authority to commute her death sentence to life imprisonment if circumstances warranted mercy. Fremont's decision would be influenced by medical evaluations of Margaret's mental condition and political considerations about territorial justice. Dr. Henry Morrison's final evaluation of Margaret's mental state concluded that she remained completely delusional about her relationship with Cassidy and incapable of understanding the wrongfulness of her actions. His recommendation for commutation based on insanity was supported by other medical experts but opposed by legal authorities who argued that mental illness could not excuse such brutal crimes. Governor Fremont's decision to uphold Margaret's death sentence was announced on July 4, 1882, following extensive consultation with medical and legal experts throughout the territory. His statement emphasized the unprecedented nature of Margaret's crimes and the need for territorial justice to respond decisively to such extreme violations of social order. The execution date was set for August 15, 1882, making Margaret the first woman to be executed in Arizona Territory and establishing a precedent that would influence territorial law for decades. Her case would be studied by legal scholars and medical experts as an early example of how frontier justice addressed complex questions about mental illness and criminal responsibility. Margaret's final weeks were characterized by continued delusions about Cassidy's imminent return and their future together, demonstrating that her mental condition had not improved despite months of medical attention and legal proceedings. Her inability to comprehend her approaching execution was both tragic and disturbing to officials who had to implement the court's judgment. The woman who had once been the moral center of one of Tombstone's most respected families was now awaiting execution for the brutal murder of that same family, all in service of preserving a relationship that had existed only in her own tortured imagination. Margaret Whitley's story had become a cautionary tale about the destructive power of obsessive love and the importance of mental health care in frontier communities. Margaret Whitley's execution on August 15, 1882, drew thousands of spectators to Tombstone from across Arizona Territory, making it the largest public gathering in the town's history. As the first woman to face execution in Arizona Territory, Margaret had become a symbol of both frontier justice and the tragic consequences of mental illness left untreated in isolated communities. The gallows constructed in the courthouse yard was designed to accommodate the massive crowds expected to witness this historic event. Newspapers from San Francisco to New York had sent correspondents to cover the execution of the Arizona lady killer, while photographers prepared to document the final chapter of one of the West's most notorious criminal cases. Margaret's final night was spent in the same delusional state that had characterized her behavior since Cassidy's abandonment. She spoke continuously to her absent lover, making plans for their reunion and discussing the new life they would build together. Her complete disconnection from reality was both heartbreaking and deeply disturbing to officials who had to implement her death sentence. The morning of August 15 began with Margaret's final meeting with Father Francisco Gonzalez, who later described their conversation as one of the most challenging of his career. Margaret remained convinced that she was about to be reunited with Cassidy rather than facing execution for murdering her family. Margaret's walk to the gallows required assistance from 2 female attendants, as her physical condition had deteriorated during months of imprisonment. She wore a simple white dress provided by the Ladies' Aid Society, the same organization she had once led in Tombstone's respectable community. The crowd of over 3,000 spectators included territorial officials, newspaper correspondents, and curiosity seekers who had traveled hundreds of miles to witness this unprecedented execution. Margaret smiled and waved to the crowd as if they were well-wishers, apparently believing the gallows was a platform for public announcements. Margaret's final words, recorded by multiple correspondents, were addressed to Jesse Cassidy as if he were present. "I kept my promise, Jesse. I cleared the path for us just like you wanted. Now we can be together forever with our beautiful daughter." Her inability to comprehend that she was about to die for murdering her family demonstrated the complete break with reality that had driven her crimes. The execution was carried out with professional efficiency by territorial officials who understood the importance of maintaining dignity during such unprecedented proceedings. Margaret's death was quick, though her final moments were marked by continued expressions of love for the man whose abandonment had triggered her homicidal breakdown. This tragic conclusion to one of the West's most shocking crimes shows why we must remember these difficult chapters of frontier history. Please subscribe and share this video with others who value understanding our complete past. News of Margaret's execution was telegraphed across the nation within hours, with newspapers carrying detailed accounts of the first woman executed in Arizona Territory. The coverage emphasized both the shocking nature of her crimes and the tragic circumstances that had led a respectable frontier matron to become a family killer. Margaret's daughter grew up in a Phoenix orphanage under an assumed name, never learning the true circumstances of her birth. The Double W Ranch was never rebuilt, becoming a local landmark that reminded visitors of the night when love and madness had combined to destroy an entire family. Margaret Whitley's story became part of Western folklore, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation and untreated mental illness on the frontier. Her case established important legal precedents regarding pregnant defendants and mentally ill criminals, influencing territorial law for decades. Today, historians recognize Margaret's case as an early example of how psychological manipulation and abandonment could drive intelligent women to commit unthinkable acts of violence. Her story serves as a reminder that behind the romanticized myths of the Old West lay human tragedies of extraordinary complexity and pain. Margaret Whitley's legacy is that of a woman who paid the ultimate price for loving a man incapable of genuine emotion, destroying her family and herself in service of a relationship that existed only in her desperate imagination. Her story continues to fascinate and horrify more than a century later, serving as a timeless warning about the destructive power of obsession and the tragic consequences when community support systems fail those who need them most. The woman who had once been the moral center of Tombstone's respectable society became its most notorious criminal, proving that even in the harsh landscape of the American frontier, no tragedy was more devastating than the complete collapse of the human heart.